McKenzie.
Mr Nutt, can I ask you what
Thank you, Mr Nutt.
Sorry, Senator Carr, I'm just going to go to Senator McKenzie and then I'll come to you.
In your opening statement, you mentioned there was a culture at Australia Post that predated Ms Holgate about how these things were dealt with, the credit card was used, I'm assuming a whole raft of governance matters around financial expenditure, including the gifting policy, that were well in existence prior to Ms Holgate arriving, or indeed yourself. Is that correct?
Look, I was not on the board prior to Ms Holgate being the CEO, so that observation reflects the cumulative learnings over 2.5 years about the way certain things were done in the past, observing certain data on the levels of expenditure in corporate services, etc. It doesn't reflect perfect knowledge or, you know, here's 7 case studies that prove that.
We've had Mr Verhoor here before this committee for years, so we're kind of across that level of it. So, given that's the case, what steps did the board or indeed yourself take as a board member to address the issue of revising the gifting policy or indeed the processes that occurred within Australia Post that led to, as you said earlier in your evidence, if you had have been in charge, the watches would never have been purchased in the first place. So what steps did you take to make sure that couldn't happen?
So when I became a director, I can only speak for myself just for the moment, during my orientation process, not only familiarised myself with the legislative and regulatory environment, not some of the great page-turners of Australian literature, I'd have to say, but also the processes, and asked the corporate secretary then and some of their staff a whole series of questions about policies and procedures around expenses, around credit cards, around audit processes, and on the basis of the information provided and the policies then in place, they seem to be in order. Subsequent to the event, and of course I should say...
But they weren't in order, were they? Because they allowed this event to occur.
Yeah, so essentially, and I've alluded to this in my remarks, essentially the difficulty is that the CEO, irrespective of who this individual is, has a lot of authority, and you can easily have a culture of facilitation. And I think you can think of many examples in other walks of life, not too far from this building, in which a culture of facilitation can get people into trouble, even when they're not trying to do the wrong thing. Fundamentally here, Ms Holgate decided to buy 4 watches. She did it for the best of intentions. She did not do it for personal benefit. And
she did it within her authority as CEO under the Australia Post guidelines.
Well, you just have to be a little bit careful there. Internal guidelines will not override a legislative and regulatory framework. The point I'm making, respectfully, I'm trying to be helpful, is that Ms Holgate, on the watches, acted with the best of intentions. She received no personal benefit. Clearly the 4 staff had done good work. I think this is common ground. If you look at it in terms of, you know, was the form stamped and did she have some capacity to spend some money, etc., yes. But that doesn't override your legislative and regulatory obligations in the PGP Act. And if you look at the Maddox report, I think, which is a pretty sensible report, does it find that she did anything improper? To be frank, did she pop down to Tiffany's at breakfast and drop $500,000 on some diamonds and ride it off to, stationery? Of course she didn't. It was well-intentioned, but it was within the provisions of the Act and the requirements, an error of judgment, but it was terribly well-intentioned.
Well, we heard evidence last week that under the Act, the only issue is that the board has a set of processes in place that it's comfortable with. There's actually no even oversight from shareholder ministers on the appropriateness of the government-owned enterprises. I'll just, maybe on notice, if you could reflect on the testimony from last week to clarify if it was correct to this committee. So just in terms of what you just, and I'll leave that for on notice for you to have a look at. So essentially it was a media storm and some political issues that meant that Ms Holgate was stood aside, that put the real pressure on for her?
No, respectfully, having worked in this building for many years for various Prime Ministers, yeah, there's a media storm. There's a media storm most days. In fact, all of you work pretty hard to whip one up, depending on which side of the fence you are. Secondly, but there are also matters of substance. And the matters of substance was there was some controversy about some corporate services expenditure in the week or so beforehand, 280, 290,000. There was controversy on the day about watches, which appeared to be expensive, which appeared to be and are expensive, as you know, the average person doesn't drop $6,500 on a watch. So there were substantive issues there about whether that was good use or proper use of public money. And there was the impression, which I'm sure was not intended by Ms Holgate, of a certain dismissiveness, you know, oh, it's, you know, commercial money, it's not public money, it's not taxpayers' money, if you look at the Hansard. So the combination of those things meant that there were substantive issues and then there was controversy and commentary about it. But the substantive issues, government decided, as government is entitled to do under the Act, ministers are entitled, and they did before question time, to have an inquiry. That's their right. And that's what they decided to do, which means you then have a reality to deal with, leaving aside, respectfully, Senator, all the commentary and, you know.
Do you think Ms Holgate was owed an apology?
By Australia Post? Not by Australia Post.
Who by?
These matters are still on foot, including issues of mediation being discussed at present. So, you know, I don't want to be drawn on that. But suffice to say that I think the totality of commentary, media commentary, commentary from various places, meant that someone who, and if I may, if Senator Carr will forgive me for drawing something Senator Carr said on the 13th, it's a complimentary reference I have to add, Senator, he made a very astute observation, which is what happens to people who haven't had much experience in dealing with the vigour of a robust parliamentary system. And even CEOs, and Christine's highly intelligent, articulate, robust, resilient sort of person, you don't get to her position in life without being so. You know, that was a level of commentary, and that increased between that day and the second. And what that meant was that she was placed under enormous pressure. So the totality of the situation was much more than a CEO would normally expect to get, certainly starting from, you know, a pleasant breakfast and you wind up going home for dinner.
Thank you, Mr Nutt. Look, do you support divestiture of non-core business of Australia Post?
Senator, I want to be very clear about this. I'm with Bob Menzies. Bob Menzies said that a person doesn't have to be a socialist to think the government should own the post office. So I support 100% public ownership. I don't support any divestiture of Australia Post assets. I don't support privatisation. I don't support breaking off in something very important like the parcels business. And can I just briefly say why without, you know, I appreciate you're on a timeline here, Senator. I don't support it because it's bad public policy. It's bad public policy because, for instance, if you divested parcels, you would put an enormous financial hole in the finances of Australia Post. You only need to look at the financials, which I won't bore you on the tedium of those, to know what that would do. So it's bad financially. Secondly, it's bad public policy. A number of members of this committee have made the point quite correctly that it would affect LPOs, it would affect jobs, it would affect the viability of Australia Post's capacity to do everything that it's expected to do in terms of community service obligations. So, bad idea, bad policy, bad finances, and while consultants and others can make their points, that's terribly interesting, and the board can, you know, have a briefing on it, that's terribly interesting. But at the end of the day, such people provide advice or guidance or suggestions, and in the words of Peter Costello, once in the House of Representatives, they advise and I decide.
Just finally, then, given the changes to e-commerce, the 21st century is upon us, and the fundamental changes in our purchasing post-COVID, do you see parcels now as core business for Australia Post going forward?
Absolutely.
Well, I look forward to supporting my private member's amendment.
I'm happy to have a look at it, Senator. Chair, sorry.
Thank you.